Not every club is born to win. Some are born to mean something. In a district where music was louder than rules, where resistance mattered more than conformity, and where identity was never negotiable. A club was born that became more than football. Not a logo, but a symbol. Not supporters, but a movement. Not a stadium, but a refuge. This isn't about titles, not about money, not about power. This is about who you are and what you stand for. About people who refuse to fall in line, about a culture that shows its own colors, about a club that decided to be different and never looked back. This is not a story about championships, this is a story about belief. Welcome to Hidden Club Stories, where every club carries a story. This is the story of St. Pauli. Hamburg is a city of water and steel, of ships that arrive and disappear again, of workers, migrants, sailors and nightlife. A gateway to the world, rough, unpolished, always moving. And in the heart of a city lies a district that never tried to be beautiful, St. Pauli. No clean facades, no quiet streets, but light, noise, music and people who don't fit anywhere else. This was home to those on the margins, those who colored outside the lines, those who made their own rules, while the rest of Hamburg looked upwards to banks, offices, and tradition. St. Pauli looked sideways, to solidarity, to freedom, to the right to be different. Cultures mixed here, ideas collided, art, music and politics blurred into one. And right there, between the harbour and the Reeperbahn, between punk and the working class, between night and conviction, a football club found its home. Not as a symbol of power, not as a display of wealth, but as a voice of the street. As an extension of a district that never wanted to be silent. A club that didn't aim to become the biggest, but instead the most itself. From sporting perspective, St. Pauli was never meant to be great, and the same city played Hamburg SV, the club of titles, the club of Europe, the club of tradition and status. And just a few kilometers away stood another stadium, smaller, older, rougher. The Millerntor. FC St. Pauli was not a club of championships, not a club of superstars, not a club of power. It was a club of people. Dock workers coming straight from their shift, students, artists, magicians. People who feel at home nowhere else except here. While others clubs dreamed of glory, St. Pauli dreamed of something else. Honesty, equality, a place where everyone was welcome. As football slowly became a product, St. Pauli stubbornly remained itself. No facade, no glitter, no promises of greatness. Just a stadium shaking with voices and a club that refused to look like the rest. And so St. Pauli never became a sporting powerhouse, but something far more rare, an identity, a belief, a home for those who didn't recognize themselves in the world outside. In the 1980s, the district began to change. Hamburg became a magnet for music, for punk, for alternative culture, for people pushing back against systems, against authority, against everything that felt frozen in place. And that culture found its way into the stadium. The Millerntor became more than a football ground, it became a meeting point, a stage, a free state. Bands played in bars around the stadium, graffiti spread across the walls, banners told stories you weren't allowed to tell elsewhere. Songs were sung here, not just about goals, but about freedom, solidarity and resistance. The skull became the symbol, not to shock, but to declare independency. To say we belong to no one. While other clubs searched for identity and tradition, St. Pauli found it in culture, and music that shouted what many were thinking, and colors that refused to behave, and people who didn't see their club as entertainment, but as an extension of their lives. Football here wasn't an escape from the world, it was the world. With all its chaos, its anger, its creativity, its hope, and that's how St. Pauli became something unique. Not because it won, but because it dared to be exactly where it was. Where culture grows, belief follows. At St. Pauli, it never stopped at music as style. It became political. Not party politics, but moral. At a time when extremism found its voice again, this club chose a side openly, against racism, against homophobia, against sexism, against fascism. Not as a marketing tool, not as a campaign, but as a principle. The stadium became a safe place for those who didn't feel safe elsewhere, for those who were different, for those who didn't fit the mold. Banners spoke louder than advertising boards, songs carried messages, colors became symbols. Here, you are allowed to be who you are, without explanation, without shame, without fear. And football world that often stayed silent to avoid losing anyone, St. Pauli refused to be silent, because silence is a choice. And this club had chosen long ago. Not power, not comfort, but values. And the belief that football can be a place where people don't just cheer, but stand for something. The Millerntor is not a cathedral of glass and concrete. Not a futuristic monument, not a temple built for television. It is old. It is rough. It is alive. Here, you stand close, shoulder to shoulder, no VIP boxes, no distance. You don't watch football here, you live it. Every post, every stair, every wall carries the marks of generations, of hands holding on, of voices that never stopped singing, of people who found their place here. The stadium is not a product, not a brand experience, it is a home. A place you don't come to consume, but to belong. Where standing matters more than sitting, where singing matters more than winning, where a community weighs more than results. In a world where stadiums are starting to look more and more like airports, the Millerntor remained a street, open, rough, honest. A place where you don't just support a team, but each other. Where the club doesn't stand above the people, but among them. And maybe that is the greatest victory St. Pauli has ever achieved. But a club that stands for something will eventually collide with a world that stands for money. Modern football grew bigger, faster and richer. Sponsors, TV rights, brands and investors. And St. Pauli could not escape it. The question became inevitable: how do you stay true to your values in a game that is losing its own? While other clubs sold their soul for security, St. Pauli hesitated. Not because they were naive, but because they knew identity cannot be bought. Every new sponsor, every new deal, every new stadium expansion was not a financial exercise, but a moral one. Does this fit who we are? Does this fit our people? Does this fit our district? St. Pauli refused to become a brand disconnected from its supporters. They didn't always choose the easiest path or the most profitable one, but again and again, they chose a path that allowed them to remain themselves. In a world of football that is constantly losing its face, this club stubbornly held onto its own. Not perfect, not without mistakes, but honest. What started in a district did not stay in a district. The values of St. Pauli resonated far beyond Hamburg. In cities across the world, the same colors appeared, the same skull, the same message. Not because the club won titles, not because it dominated Europe, but because it represented something that had become rare, a position. For people who no longer recognized themselves in polished commercial football, St. Pauli became a symbol, a club you didn't choose because it won, but because you believed in what it was. In Berlin, in London, in South America, and Asia, everywhere people were looking for a place in football that didn't feel sold, but real. The shirt was no longer merchandise, it was a statement. Not fashion, but belonging. As if a small district in Hamburg has suddenly started speaking a language the world could understand. Not the language of power, but the language of belief. Not the language of money, but of identity. Maybe St. Pauli will never be the richest club. Maybe it will never win the most trophies. Maybe it will never build the biggest stadium. But that was never the point. Some clubs live of glory, others of history, others of power, and some live of meaning. The feeling that you belong somewhere, that you're not alone, that you're allowed to be who you are without apology. In a world where everything has to be faster, bigger, and louder, this club remains stubbornly slow, stubbornly human, stubbornly itself. It reminds us that football is not only about winning, but about standing together, singing together, believing together. About a stadium that isn't a product but a place. About a club that doesn't want to be a brand but a community. And as long as in Hamburg people keep gathering under those lights, as long as voices keep rising in that district, as long as someone lifts a skull flag and says, "This is where we belong," this club will continue to exist, not as a champion, but as a belief, not as power, but as a symbol. Not the loudest story in football, but perhaps one of the most honest. Thank you for watching this episode of Hidden Club Stories. If you enjoyed this story and want to discover more clubs, consider to leave a like and subscribe to my channel.